Good morning. Welcome to the third day of our March meetings. I was informed by someone that if you're watching the YouTube, that you could actually not see the heads of us on this side of the table. I have to say that's intentional. People suggested that they didn't want to see me. So we've worked that out. You see, we're a very responsive board. But I'm sorry if you were looking forward to seeing our happy faces on this side of the table on the YouTube broadcast. This morning, we're going to start off with our technology position project. And if you remember at our September board meeting, at the board reached the conclusion, our December board meeting, the board reached the conclusion as part of its strategy process is that we needed a collective position on technology to inform ongoing and future projects, in that we needed to really sort of kick the tires on whether the way we have dealt with technology is sufficient for the evolving state of play. We enter this project, this effort, with no preconceived outcome on what the right approach should be. However, with a bias towards us being bold in our thinking and really challenging where we are as a board on this topic. We should not view this as a binary exercise. It's not a question of requiring technology or not speaking about technology in its standards. It's also not a question of actually maybe mandated requirements. There's a number of tools we could put in our toolkit as a standard setting board to address the advent of technology. To me, there is a bias towards action of some form in this space. And I really highly recommend us to push the boundaries and particularly ask the right questions up front before we actually determine what the specific solutions are going forward. So I really look forward to this session. We're going to spend a half an hour with the introduction, and then we're going to go into workshop format. Slight amendment to the agenda on the workshops. This first workshop will not go just from 9:30 to 11. It'll go from 9:30 to 11:30 right now, and then we will break. Clearly, if people need a short break in between, that you could go from your workshop session. As you say, we will still break for lunch at 1 p.m. And then the public session will begin again at 2 p.m. on audit evidence. Any questions before we begin or reflections? I'm really excited about this effort. I think this is one of the things when the monitoring group reforms came about, this desire to talk about more strategic issues at the board table. And I can think of very, very few issues more strategic than this technology position. Let me just also say that the output doesn't necessarily need to be a big white paper. We're not targeting that. It could be a very short paper. It could be PowerPoint slides mainly to guide us going forward. We will need to come up with some roadmap once we reach our position. So Angelo, Thade, I think the floor is yours.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? This mic is picking up. All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you, Tom. All right, what I thought I'd start off with is just a couple of housekeeping items first. I haven't met a lot of the board members, or some of the board members yet, some TAs, some observers. So I wanted to start out with a quick introduction of who I am. And then I wanted to thank a few people that contributed to this session. So I've been with the IAASB for 9 months now. I support the fraud and the technology projects. Before that, or rather, I was a former auditor at a Big Four firm in Canada, and ultimately ended up at the Canadian Audit Regulator, where I spent 13 years, and most recently as their head of thought leadership. So that had me focused on topics like audit innovation, technology, crypto, and engaging with innovation leaders in Canada, but also the global innovation leaders at the big 6 firms globally as part of my role at IFER's Technology Task Force. So enough about the bona fides. I want to thank some of the members from the technology consultation group. We met a couple of times before this meeting. I'll just call them out. Danielle, Joanna, Sue, Wendy, Warren, for their invaluable contributions as we brainstormed how to put this session together. I also want to thank Jean, who's with us from IAASB. So Jean's part of our technology consultation group now because we, in the spirit of this continuing coordination between IAASB and the IAASB. And last but not least, certainly not least, a big thank you to Willie, Tom, Fadi, and Kalina for being so generous with their time. Okay, enough with all of that. Why don't we get into the program? And next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. Okay, so the plan, as Tom mentioned, I won't spend a lot of time here. We're gonna live stream 30 minutes. I'll do a little bit of talking, so thank you for indulging me on that. And then we're gonna break, and then we'll come back and we'll get into the private workshop. Really, the point of this live stream of this public segment is to introduce our stakeholders to the technology position initiative, and also to, in the spirit of transparency, tell the public a little bit about what the board is going to be discussing during the private workshop. So next slide, please. Okay, so we've been using this term technology position a lot, but what does that mean? So a good place to start is with the strategy and work plan that the board approved in December. And the articulation there is that the board in the first half of 2024 would establish a technology position that addresses the impact of technology in the IAASB standards, including the board's vision and roadmap. Now, this position will inform standard setting and related activities during the work plan period. Sounds easy enough? As I started to reach out to various people and stakeholders and board members, I found very, very different views on what that meant. And three themes started to emerge, essentially. Some thought it was about technologies and what kind of technology and types of technologies. And is it technologies used by entities, or is it technologies used by auditors, or is it both? So that's one theme. Another theme was how the IAASB should approach standard setting in relation to technology. For example, I heard a little bit about, is our approach, this piecemeal approach where we will open up a standard, revise it to reflect impacts of technology, is that adequate? Another perspective was, well, maybe we need an omnibus project. So the board's heard all of this before. You've deliberated on this quite a bit, but it's important for our stakeholders to kind of know what I'm referring to here in terms of the standard setting approach. And still others thought that it was about how the IAASB remains informed. What experts do we have access to? How do we tap into that expertise? How do we keep track of emerging developments in the area of technology? So it turns out that all three of these themes are incredibly important. And they will be part of the technology position because it's all three of them are really important. And so the way we've captured that is we've entrenched these three themes into a conceptual framework, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide, please, Michelle. Thank you. So about this conceptual framework, it's not really, there's nothing mystical about it. It's not the most groundbreaking. It's just a framework to keep us focused on each component separately. It's to add structure to our conversations. That's really what this is. And I'll just walk you through really quickly what that is. The first component is the board establishing its technology posture. So you might ask, why do we call it posture and not position? Well, position was taken, and we needed a name for the component, so we called it the posture. And what that is really, it's going to guide the board's standard setting and other related activities during the work plan period. I think of this component more as sort of like the board's technological North Star during your work plan period. The second component will have the board deciding on an approach on how to operationalize that technological North Star, the posture. And finally, like any good framework, the third component is a feedback loop. The did I say any good conceptual framework? You've got this feedback loop, which is to make sure that the posture remains always well calibrated to new developments that are happening in the world. And we've had all of this as a board. It's just adding some structure to it. And so next slide, please, Michelle. So here's a tentative timeline. Tom spoke a little bit about this. Today the board will be focused on components 1 and 2 today. In June, we'll reconvene. We'll continue to talk about 1 and 2, and we'll start to approach component 3. And then in September, if everything goes well, we'll be closer, or in fact, Willie's going to react if I don't say it. We'll be all the way there in terms of this having the board approve a technology position. So that's our North Star in terms of the timing. Next slide, please. Okay, so before the board sets out to deliberate on what its technology posture should be.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Maybe my misunderstanding, but I thought when we discussed this in the last board meeting that we were aiming for a June position and roadmap, given that this is driving where risk and response goes and a lot of our other stuff.
So, my position on this is that maybe, first of all, we have the full knowledge of where we're moving on this, but I really would prefer us to make sure that we take the necessary time to achieve this. If we could get this done in June, we'll get this done in June, but I don't believe that this is necessarily as easy to get it done in June, and I'd rather this is going to guide everything that we do for the not so distant future from a technology perspective. So if we have a consensus that's forming in June, we'll push it in June. We will have the knowledge of where we're moving by June, but we committed as a board in the strategy document to finish this in the calendar year. So already September is an advancement from that calendar year. So we should be ready to finish this as soon as we are, but we do have the whole calendar year. I think September is a reasonable time to get it done. And if we could get it done in June, great, we'll be done in June. But we'll see how much consensus we have after today.
Okay, thank you for that. As the board sets out to deliberate what its posture will be or should be, I think it's useful and for the board to just take a pause and think about where it has been in terms of a technology posture, in terms of revising ISO 220, ISO 315, 600, and other things that are in the pipeline. In other words, I think it's useful for the board to agree on where it is before it turns its attention to where it wants to be. So you'll recall when we surveyed the board a couple of weeks before this meeting, and we sought perspectives on whether the articulation on the board makes any sense. Is it accurate? Is this an accurate representation of what the board's current posture is? And I'll read it out just for the sake of people that are listening in and not looking at the screen. The board's current technology posture as it develops or revises the ISOs is not to require, but rather to acknowledge and support the use of technology in audits through guidance integrated in the application material of the ISOs. So some observers have looked at this posture and have commented, and when I was on the outside, we commonly referred to this as the technology agnostic posture. Now we're going to obviously, as the board will have an opportunity to discuss whether that technology agnostic posture is accurate or not. But what we heard in the survey, interestingly enough, is that this is most board members agree that this is a pretty good articulation of where the board is at right now. Nevertheless, there were views that it could be articulated more broadly because the board does more than just ISOs, does non-authoritative guidance and other things as well. So it's kind of referring to the broader toolkit and not just the ISOs. So again, we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about where that posture is and where the board thinks it should be, if we need to change it during the private workshop. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this slide has a lot of words. Forgive me for that. This is now that we have this working definition of what the board's current technology posture is. The board during the private workshop will turn its attention to where that posture is, whether that posture remains suitable in light of how dramatically the world has changed, including all the advancements that we've all been hearing about in the news in generative AI and other technologies. And way further down the pipeline, but it's coming, is quantum computing. But I'm not going to bring that up because it's probably 10 years out, according to some research. So we listed on this slide some of the things that the board that might factor into the board's thinking in terms of whether its current technology posture remains suitable. I'm going to cover 3 of those factors really quickly. So the first factor has to do with how entities themselves are using technology in their information systems, including in their business processes. And I'm speaking about that use of technology that impacts their financial reporting. So, for example, are entities using, or are they expected to be using, more black box technologies? There's a well-known trade-off that I'm sure everybody's heard about between the performance of an AI system and its explainability. So as the AI system becomes progressively or increasingly more sophisticated, it becomes increasingly more challenging to understand it, or in the case of an audit, to audit it. A related consideration is whether the use by entities of sophisticated tech means that, meaning tech that impacts their financial reporting, of course, in turn impacts whether auditors themselves need to use sophisticated tech. So for example, do auditors need to use an AI in order to audit an AI system? What we've heard, we've had some outreach and meetings, what we've heard is that some firms are actively engaged in trying to figure this very question out. So it's not trivial in terms of how do you audit, for example, a large language model or other AI that's being used in an at the entity. A second factor has to do with the auditor's use of technology. And as auditors are using increasingly more sophisticated tools, and we know that audit firms are making big investments in AI because it's in the news, how is that going to affect how audits are done? Is that going to create, as we mentioned in the paper, a misalignment in terms of how audits are done in practice, either today or in the near future, and how an audit is envisioned within the IAASB? So for example, if you have, let's say, an AI tool that can do a lot of stuff, end-to-end kind of stuff in an audit, risk assessment and further audit procedures, how do you apply 315 and 330 when the IAASB contemplate distinct phases of the audit? Now, I know that this has been covered a little bit in an FAQ by the technology consultation group, but it's worth thinking about. Okay, one thing I'll say here is the IAASB did go out to stakeholders in 2018, you might recall, to ask them about what kind of technology are you seeing, and give us your feedback in terms of how it impacts standard setting. And stakeholders came back and said pretty clearly in 2018, the IAASBs are not, and we use this word in the report, so I'm not, the IAASBs are not fundamentally broken. I'm sure the board will remember that. Insofar as the resilience of the IAASBs to the use of technology in audits. Now, nevertheless, it's useful for the board to think about, does that remain true today? Where 2018 seems like a million years ago in terms of the technology journey. And it's worth thinking about the board thinking about not just technology that's being used today in audits, but also what might be used 3 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Maybe that's too far, but it's worth thinking about, are the IAASBs still, do they remain resilient to the use of that kind of tech in the audit. And the third area has to do with this, what appears to be a palpable expectation, growing expectation, that auditors use technological tools where appropriate, of course, to obtain more persuasive audit evidence. We referred to a paper by Accountancy Europe in the agenda paper, and they make the case that the transition to a more data-driven audit through the use of tools may be needed by the audit profession to remain, I think their words were, relevant and to continue to attract top talent. Those were their perspectives. Within the context of this increasing adoption that we're seeing across all industries, throughout the world, of technology to derive insights, extract insights from data, is there a role for the IAASB that the IAASB should play or ought to play in terms of fostering innovation in audits to enhance audit quality in the public interest? So that's something that the board will be thinking about and deliberating. Next slide, please. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, and then after the board's turned its attention to starting to shape its technology posture that will guide its work plan activities, it will turn its attention during the private workshop today to thinking a little bit about how do we bring this to action? How do we operationalize? What's the proper approach? And this will have the board looking at many things. There's not just the stuff that's on this screen. The stuff on this screen will probably be relevant regardless or irrespective of where the board ends up in terms of its posture, but certainly there will be other questions that will emerge depending on where the board ends up on component one. And I've listed here the toolkit that the IAASB has, and the other one has to do with the approach that the IAASB takes. And I talked a little bit about versus the piecemeal versus omnibus. And here you've got centralized, a decentralized. Centralized refers to, do you have a dedicated team of technology standard setting people that are responsible for this as their center of desk kind of duty? Or is it decentralized and handled by individual project teams? Is it a hybrid of the two? So there's rich kind of conversation that can happen in terms of the approach. And next slide, please, Michelle. And that's the end of my prepared remarks. And I think maybe I'll ask if there's any comments before we and I'll turn it over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Okay, and thank you, Angela. That was very helpful setting this out. Any comments or questions, Justine?
Oh, thank you.
You know, one of the things that I think about in this is, do we think that technology is as pervasive in its use in the world of audit as we have seen in other professions, particularly regulated professions? I would probably, having come from financial services, estimate not. You know, there are things that we could borrow from other regulated professions too to drive insights. I'm not saying necessarily our specific decisions on where we go or not, but are there lessons that we can learn, particularly from prudential regulators in this space on technology? But I think we're in a really interesting place, and what the options are. Like, is it a question of guardrails that we need to create that would help standardize approaches to get people more comfortable with the deployment and regulators more comfortable? I think all those questions should be asked in the coming workshops this morning as well. We have a few more minutes before we close this session. I don't know if there's any other insights. I would suggest almost in question forms as well of things that you would suggest that people think about as we enter these workshops the rest of this morning. Anyone? Sammy?
I would say one thing to think about, because ultimately our goal is to serve the investors at the end of the day. So it's like, what do the investors want? Do they want auditors to be more technology driven, technology proficient, or are they happy with the way the audit is being conducted? Does it give them more comfort to see the audit firms using more technology tools or not?
I think that's a good point about what the objective is too, but another way to state it is whatever we do, it should be the name of audit quality or in the public interest, right? We're not calling for technology just because technology exists, but it's in the service of enhancing confidence in audit engagements and the quality. So I think that's a really important principle, maybe, that we all ground ourselves in. I assume that we agree that whatever we do, it should be in the name of enhancing audit quality. And to be clear, I think, Angela, one of the things we should talk about here is that the scope of this exercise too is that we're really focusing, for the purpose of this exercise, on audit, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Christelle?
I'm wondering about the role of intermediaries. The fact that some audit firms will not be able to develop inside the firm this technology, different technologies, and the fact that they will ask to external firms, and they will buy this technology. So in terms of quality, confidentiality, transparency. So I think that this technology position must take into account that the perimeter will be larger than just audit firms. Thank you.
Really good insight. Neil?
Tom, just back on your point that this is to focus on audit. I would have imagined that this is audit and assurance, and although the conversations may be more focused on audit in the near term, I wouldn't exclude assurance from technology discussions.
Yeah, I think, Neil, you're completely right. I think we've set that up as one of the things we will talk about in the breakout sessions as well. But what we said is maybe it is good to just use the ISAS as a starting point, because it is our most prominent, the most comprehensive suite of standards. And then if you think about that, but I do agree with you, there will be then a need to adapt and expand that across, because also, as we articulated it in the strategy and work plan, it's about the impact of technology in the IAASB standards, not just ISAS. Yeah.
Thanks for that point, Neil, and Billy, for the clarification. Any other? James? Okay, any other reflections before we close the public session? Okay, we're gonna conclude the public session for the morning and return at 2 p.m. I'd ask everyone to wait here for a second. Afterwards, we'll give you some further instruction. We ready to break? Okay, can we close the broadcast?